There's an increasingly complex body of law about how humans and other animals relate to each other. I'm Dan Ringer, and we'll talk about the law of animals right now on the LawWorks.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
The LawWorks is made possible by the generous support of the West Virginia State Bar, the Monongalia County Bar Association, and by a major grant from the West Virginia Bar Foundation, promoting public knowledge of the law in West Virginia. The West Virginia Bar Foundation, the philanthropic organization for West Virginia's legal profession and justice system.
Animals are very much in the news these days, either what we do to them or what they do to us. My guests are WVU Law Professor Will Rhee and WVU Political Science Professor Susan Hunter. Will, Susan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I suppose the first question is, why worry about animals the way we do? Don't we have enough problems worrying about human beings?
Well, I don't think worrying about animals has to be mutually exclusive from worrying about human beings. If you consider, as human beings, we interact with animals in so many ways, everywhere from what we eat, what we wear, the products that we use, the companion pets that we have, to the concerns that we have as in our popular culture about animals. So I think that much of what we do as humans, just looking at it as humans, impacts animals.
Both of you teach university level classes in, let's say, animal welfare. Will, yours is animal law. Susan, what do you teach?
Mine is animal law and policy. So it's looking at not just what the law is, but how that law is made and the interest groups that interact to develop the law and the agencies that enforce the laws.
Why are we teaching these classes? Historically, we have not. There have not
Correct.
been not only university level classes, there have been high school or grade school classes. Where do these classes come from?
Well, the real question is, why did it take us so long to realize that this is such an intimate area of policy and the law that we should have been studying it all along? Animals have been interacting with humans since the dawn of time, and we've had laws to govern what government does with animals for centuries. And so why has political science, which does that exactly, ignored this huge area of policy and law?
Well, did students ask for it, or your faculty member, did you say this is something I'm interested in, it's what I want to do? Or did somebody come down from on high and say, thou shalt teach a course in animal policy?
Well, for me, I said, no political science departments in the United States are teaching this course. Wouldn't it be good if we were a pathbreaker in this area? And so I really pitched the course myself.
Are there classes now at other institutions beyond just WVU?
There are courses in psychology, in sociology, and certainly in law, but really not in political science, no.
Will, why are you teaching?
Well,
the
I can
class?
tell you that initially, when I came to WVU to be a law professor, there was a student petition actually requesting such a course. In law schools, animal law is taught, I think, more than any other area of the academy. There are something between 90 to 100 animal law courses being taught in various law schools in the United States, and maybe over 100 student chapters of the Animal Legal Defense Fund. So initially, it was just interest convergence. Basically, some students wanted the course, and I was very interested in it. And putting aside the other aspects of why I think animal law is worthy in its own right, just from the perspective of learning doctrine and learning to be creative with the law, it's a wonderful interdisciplinary area that essentially covers all areas of the law. Basically, all law is animal law. It's where any area of law intersects with animals or non-human beings as individuals. That's what is animal law. So animal law runs the gamut from very philosophical debates about personhood and animal rights to veterinary malpractice to what do you do with hoarders to custody issues when you have a divorce over pets. I mean, to how do you regulate the slaughter of animals. I mean, it runs a whole gamut of constitutional, legislative, regulatory issues. So from just the perspective of law students, I think it's a great way of learning to look outside of the traditional blinders of just one law school course versus another law school course and seeing the entire law holistically.
Well, it seems like any issue in law that involves people, virtually, you could substitute an animal for one of the people and debate the same issues, but not necessarily with the same outcomes. Surprisingly, animal welfare, animal law, animal regulation has been a very, very hot topic in our society, but rather hidden from sight. We're familiar with things like laws concerning endangered species, but at a college or a university, if a psychologist or a psychology student wants to do an experiment with a pigeon or a rat, they have a lot of hurdles that they have to jump through to get permission to do that, and they have to justify the experiment. When you get into the more formal medical sciences, physiology, biochemistry, and medicine, to use animals in research is subject to a great deal of scrutiny, and the ways the animals are cared for is very critically studied. And one of the first questions that comes up is, what's an animal? And you're welcome to try to answer that.
Well,
Will, go ahead.
I would say that's a great question, and of course the lawyerly response would be whatever the legislature defines it as being or whatever a court defines it as being. But I think that is one of the great challenges of animal law is the line drawing. Is if you're going to carve out any sort of specialized legal protections for certain non-human beings, you have to draw the line somewhere. And I think a lot of the debate over this has to do with line drawing. So, for example, there is this project, I believe Peter Singer is in charge of the Great Ape Project, and recently the Spanish Parliament passed a law basically allowing sort of these fundamental, essentially, rights for what are defined as great apes, and I think they're like very minimal, like the right to be free from torture, the right to, not to be confined cruelly, the right to have companionship, very minimal rights. But what's interesting about the Great Ape Project's definition is it uses a genetic definition, I believe 98% of human DNA. So there are some, whereas a chimpanzee might qualify under that law, I believe a rhesus monkey would not qualify under that law. So the line drawing is, I think, very difficult, and that's a great question.
Well, I know scientifically we distinguish between monkeys and primates, and and when you're dealing with primates in an academic setting, the rules are really strict. You don't put the animal, you may have a very nice confined area for the animal, but you don't leave the animal there by itself. You have to provide companionship, mental stimulation. The law basically treats them as though they were somewhat imperfect human beings.
And federal law is continuing to evolve that law. I mean, almost every year there are new provisions and adjustments to that law to strengthen it.
And it kind of flows downstream to other higher animals, and we could probably debate the use of the word higher there too, yes. are receiving the same kind of treatment, or the law is expecting the same kind of treatment. When we talk about animals like dogs that people form very close bonds with, we look at them detachedly, but they're still dogs, and we still want to care for them.
Well, cats are an interesting species because cats are vermin.
In West Virginia law, actually.
Under West Virginia law. And in fact, New Jersey is trying to pass a law to declare them to be a prey animal so that hunters can shoot them.
We're going to have cat hunts?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
I've never heard of it.
But in some states, cats are specifically defined as property, and in some states they come under cruelty laws, in some states they don't. The feral cat issue now is one that states are really having to address, because here is an animal that's a domestic animal but it's not domesticated. And so how do you treat them? And legislatures and municipal and county governments are really having to struggle to define feral cats.
Well, in West Virginia, we're having municipally sponsored deer hunts because deer are perceived by some to be just really big rats, that they're a problem. They consume things that we would like to consume. They mess up things that we don't want messed up. Animals do tend to fall legally into two different categories, at least two categories, wild animals and property, animals that we own. And we treat them differently based on that.
Right, and you have to really add the exotics, which are a separate class of non-indigenous wild animals.
Well, those are kind of wild animals that we force to live with, the non-domesticated.
Well, they're non-indigenous, and so an exotic animal, a tiger, is a wild animal in some areas, but it's non-indigenous to West Virginia, so they come under different laws and different treatment than the wildlife that's native to the state.
Will, where is this law of animals going? When you stand up in front of a class, what do you warn them that they want to prepare themselves for?
Well, the way I teach the class, it's a seminar and they write a paper. And I think that because animal law is so broad and it has so many different issues, it's really rich for creativity. My personal opinion is, I think that if you look at the law of animals, it is inconsistent. That there's definitely different contexts. There are different principles that apply with certain types of non-human beings, and other ones, these principles don't apply. To me, the only way that I can make sense of it is to look at animal law essentially as a mirror of human law. In other words, if you try to make sense out of animal law from the perspective of the animals, it just doesn't make sense because it's contradictory and depends on different circumstances. But if you look at it as a way of seeing what do we as a society, what do we as humans value, what do we prioritize? Oftentimes when we're dealing with the regulation of animals, there are competing interests, and you're balancing competing interests. And if you look at it from that perspective, I think you get a clearer picture of the way that humanity views animals as individuals.
Well, I had always heard it said that in olden times when we had such things, you could tell what a man was really like by the way he treated his horses. And now I suppose we would modify that a little bit, since most of us don't have horses, to say the way he or she treats their pets, their dogs and their vermin cat. Now, if you're a cat fancier, you might object to that characterization.
They object pretty strongly to that characterization, yes.
But the same token, if you live in Australia where wild dogs are really a problem, then the laws there work the same way. It's just whatever animal is the biggest problem to you. And if you live in certain West Virginia cities, deer, Bambi, is a problem. So we're going to get rid of it. We can't talk about the way we relate to animals and the way society relates to animals without mentioning the name Michael Vick. And several people asked me as we prepared for this show, so you're going to talk about Michael Vick, you're going to talk about Michael Vick. And I said, I think that's inescapable. We have to. Because he represents, or represented, a portion of society that treated their animals very much differently from the way most members of society do. If you remember the Michael Vick case, he spent a fair amount of time in prison because he engaged in the activity, I'm going to call it a sport, in the activity of dog fighting. And along with dog fighting, we have cockfighting. But we also have some pretty brutal forms of human fighting too. It's not just boxing, which a lot of people would think is brutal enough, but we see references to things like ultimate fighting and things like that, where the objective is to beat your opponent senseless, quite literally. So what part of society do we look at to say this is what defines humane society? And what does humane mean anyway? Does it mean humans treating people or other objects correctly, or the way humans treat humans? So what standard do we apply to this animal-human interaction?
You know, I had a football player student once tell me that he thought I was too nice to enjoy football because he said it's a brutal sport and I wouldn't think you would enjoy it. So
I've played it. He's right.
yes, I tend to agree. For me, the difference between animal fighting and human fighting is that the human fighting is voluntary and people have chosen to engage in that and they can stop whenever they choose. For dog fighting in particular, there's also the argument that cockfighting is also voluntary. If you have two roosters in a room, they're going to fight to the death, and so we're just watching it. Dog fighting, I'm not saying I agree, I'm just telling you the argument.
I was a little skeptical, but that...
I am too, but dog fighting, these animals are brutalized to teach them to fight. And they use puppies and kittens and dangle them above the animals to teach them to fight. And with Michael Vick, they hung or electrocuted the animals that refused to fight or didn't fight well. And so there's a level of brutality there that is really getting pleasure from pain. And I think that goes far beyond what we talk about with watching boxing, for example.
And we criminalize that behavior. In fact, some societies have punished animals for their behavior, have essentially criminalized animal behavior, although that tends to literally be medieval, not so much recently.
Although in 1947 they hanged an elephant in Irwin, Tennessee.
We probably ought to ask you to tell us that story if you know it.
Well, the animal was a circus animal, and I don't know whether you've read about the brutality toward elephants, but the training for elephants is incredibly brutal. They basically use spears that they jab in them to
They call them prods.
Yes, but they're basically spears. They break the skin, and they're chained, they're manacled, and so they don't get much exercise. And this particular elephant tried to take a piece of food away from a child that was passing, and in that effort killed the child. And so the first response was that to shoot the elephant, and they shot it over and over and over and over, and it just wouldn't die. I mean, so they're just standing there. And so they drove it to a railroad yard and hanged it from the railroad crane.
By the neck, I assume?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, that raises a lot of interesting thoughts, if not particularly issues. Elephants are perceived to be very intelligent animals, as are horses, dogs, still debating cats.
Pigs are another one.
Pigs, yeah, and particularly some species of them are quite, Vietnamese pot-bellied pigs, I think, are said to be very intelligent. Dolphins, killer whales. So how do we treat other intelligent species? We hang elephants because they almost certainly inadvertently hurt a child. What do we do with the killer whale that drowns the handler, as happened not too long ago?
I was surprised they didn't kill the whale.
In fact, I think it was the second time that particular animal was involved in the death of an attendant of some sort, or so it was said. Routinely, we kill dogs for harming someone.
I think that maybe we are seeing a little bit of a shift. You know, maybe we're starting to, at least in popular culture, anthropomorphize animals a little more. So I'm just thinking of, there was a recent story of these two pugs whose owner apparently committed suicide, and they ended up actually eating the owner, and because they had nothing to eat, and you know, nothing happened to them.
It's a perfectly natural
They were
action.
adopted,
Yeah.
you know, and they were just like, well, I mean, they had no food, they had to eat. Whereas, you know, in earlier times, I could see people would be horrified by that, you know, that maybe we're growing in our sophistication also of, you know, being able to understand, see the perspective of, well, from the animal's perspective, it's you know, why that happened. I think you see that a lot with these sort of wild animal people having wild animals as pets, and when they kill their owners or when they act out, part of it is like, well, I mean, what did you expect? I mean, you're keeping a giant boa constrictor in your basement. I mean, of course it's going to eat you. Like, what were you doing that?
What happened to and I don't remember what, it was an orangutan, some sort of large ape that attacked a woman's visitor and horribly injured her.
That animal was killed.
Yeah, it was shot by the police, I think, right then, wasn't it?
But is that the right thing to do? I mean, the animal was behaving in reaction to the circumstances that it didn't select around it. Undoubtedly felt threatened or under some sort of stress and acted out. It had been reported to have that kind of reaction in the past, to be at least a potentially violent animal, but we killed it. We didn't kill the killer whale. The word killer whale is not exactly the right label for that. Orca, I think, is sometimes also used. But they're generally believed to be gentle, relatively benign animals, until apparently we lock them in a tank and say, you can swim in little teeny tiny circles and this lady here will give you fish. We create the circumstances, the animal reacts to the circumstances, then we kill the animal. It doesn't seem right somehow.
Well, we kill animals when they're no longer useful to us all the time. I mean, our local shelter, and somebody once told me I sounded negative toward the shelter, and I said, I'm not negative toward the personnel at the shelter at all, but we have shelters and they're not shelters. They're impoundment facilities, and they kill the animals if they're not adopted within a fairly short period of time. If no one wants them, we kill them. The big argument on horses right now in the United States is that we have no horse slaughterhouses, and Congress is trying now to pass a law against exporting horses for slaughter. And the horse lobby is fighting that tooth and nail, because they say once a horse has no usefulness, what are we supposed to do with it? And at least slaughter provided some instrumental use for the animal rather than just killing it and digging a hole and burying it.
Well, at one time, though, horses were everywhere. Every family owned at least one. Any working family with a farm or with carriages or wagons to pull might own several. I suppose you would spend all your time burying horse carcasses in a society like that, so you look to utilize them. But in today's world, we use the euphemistic phrase, put down dogs and cats and other companion animals when they get too old to care for. I just recently had to do that, and in the process, I was evaluating all of the options. Is it possible to do this? Is it possible to do that? And the answer was no. When it's time for something to die, you have to let that happen. Technologically, we can keep animals and people alive a lot longer than they probably would want to be kept alive. So where do we draw these lines? And I guess there is no standard out there against which we can judge these things.
I mean, my own interpretation is that it goes down to the social utility that we as humans view the particular animal. So, for example, with the killer whale that you mentioned, I mean, that whale was also generating income, and the person that it killed was also working there, as an employee, generating income, and that might be a socially preferable context because we like to have animals for entertainment. I mean, animals are a huge economic there's a huge economic factor as well, whether the entertainment, whether in the agricultural industry. In the other context, when you have sort of people keeping pets that they shouldn't keep, I mean, you could look at it as saying, well, there's not really much social utility in you having an individual right to own a dangerous animal and not being properly trained, or maybe not having, there's not much benefit to get out. There's a lot of risk there. So I still think that the only way to really understand the contradictory web of laws and regulations we have dealing with animals is to look at it from the well, what's basically in it for the humans. And when you look at it that way, I think it does make sense. How.
Well, I sometimes thought that back before the dawn of time, there was a war between humans and animals. Animals would eat humans, humans would eat animals. The humans won, and the animals are paying for it. Will Rhee, Susan Hunter, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you also for being with us. On behalf of the LawWorks, I'm Dan Ringer. Good evening. On the LawWorks webpage at thelawworks.org, you'll find a listing of recent The LawWorks show topics and additional information about this show's topic. If you would like to recommend this program to a friend, you'll find video of this program at thelawworks.org, and you can find previous programs on YouTube. If you would like to suggest a topic for a future The LawWorks show, or if you're a school teacher and would like to receive a copy of this program for classroom use, please send us an email to thelawworks@comcast.net.
The LawWorks is produced in cooperation with the West Virginia State Bar, the Mountain State Bar, and the West Virginia University College of Law. The LawWorks is made possible by the generous support of the West Virginia State Bar, the Monongalia County Bar Association, and by a major grant from the West Virginia Bar Foundation, promoting public knowledge of the law in West Virginia. The West Virginia Bar Foundation, the philanthropic organization for West Virginia's legal profession and justice system.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.